Good afternoon and welcome everybody to another Deckhive Introduces session. It's lovely to see you all. I'm here today with my colleague Martin, as usual, and with Charlotte Housden, who is here today to tell us all about her Liminal Muse cards. Welcome, Charlotte.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you all. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you to all of you for giving your time today. So we're just going to talk a little bit to start with about, I'm going to ask you about your background and so on, and then we're going to go into a bit more detail, aren't we, on the cards. But it would be great to start by just, well, let's find out a bit more about you and your background.
Yeah, thank you. So like Michelle and Martin, I'm an occupational psychologist. I'm also a coaching psychologist, and I've had quite a long career in consulting. I used to work for KPMG, big management consultancy, and a number of small niche consultancies. So one of them was an occupational psychology consultancy, another one was a branding consultancy, employer brand, that kind of thing. I'm also, on top of all that, I'm a photographer, and I felt that in my career, I wasn't really using any of my creative side. So I wasn't using my photography. I'm also, I have a background in music, and I wasn't playing any instruments anymore. And I went off to a coaching constellation workshop. And if anyone's familiar with that, you basically you bring an issue, people in the room work in a constellation, and people represent different parts of your life. So actually I picked somebody in the room who actually looks quite like me, a woman called Michele, another Michele, and glasses, dark hair. And I picked her to be creativity in my constellation because I wanted to explore the idea of how I could integrate that more into my consulting practice. Anyway, after the coaching constellation, she came up to me and said, actually, I'm a coach, I'm a supervisor, I'm a writer of books. And I've had a quick look in the lunch break, I've had a quick look at your website, your photography website, and I absolutely love your images. Would you work with me? I was like, oh, okay, that would be great. And she said she was looking for a coaching intervention that used photography, was quite divergent, quite open-ended, and didn't have words and it wasn't directive. And would I consider using my images to create this pack? So over a number of years, it started in 2018, and over a number of years, we developed the hard copy pack, and we iterated it, we changed it a number of times. In fact, I've got a pack here. We tried it out with lots of coaches, and many coaches are women. And to begin with, it was way too big. It was almost like a beer mat, and people couldn't kind of get their hands around it. So we ended up iterating it and making it smaller and rounding the edges and getting quite a nice finish on it. And we ran loads of workshops and conferences and focus groups, and everyone loved the cards, and it was great, and we were selling them. And COVID hit back in February, March last year. And quite a lot of our clients, our customers who were buying the cards, were basically saying, we love them, but we don't want to have to buy 20 packs of cards for a one-off intervention with a client, just in case we might use them in the session. Is there a way we can do this online? And Michele and I are not IT gurus. We're like, oh, how the hell do we do this? What are we actually going to do? So we tried a number of platforms. We tried using Miro, which some of you may have used, which is a whiteboard technology, which is lovely, but a bit complicated. And we would run workshops with clients, with coaches and facilitators and therapists. And quite often, rather than getting into a really lovely sort of emotional somatic space with the cards, which is what the point is with the images, they'd kind of go straight into their heads, and they would get really anxious about the technology, and it was all too complicated. So we then moved to Jamboard and tried that, which was simpler, but it was similar kind of problems. And that's kind of where I met Michele and Martin, because in January, February of this year, one of our clients, one of our coaching customers said, have you heard about a platform called Deckhive? Like, oh, haven't heard of it. And then introduced Michele and me to Martin and Michele. And then, as I say, the kind of rest is history. But it's been a really interesting journey the last year to try and find a way to turn our physical cards into something digital. I hope that's answered your question. Quite a long preamble.
No, that I think that's really helpful, and I think certainly for me there are lots of chords that have been chimed in terms of our experience of using cards, and that physical experience of using them. It's the simplicity, isn't it? It's the fact that you don't have to be thinking about complex processes and procedures to be using them, and so you can be properly absorbed in the activity. And so yes, it can really relate to that sense of wanting an online solution that is simple, and that obviously is how we came to develop Deckhive too. And so it's really interesting to hear that, and to hear all of the workshops and the work that you've done sort of pre-COVID around the cards. And so do you want to tell us a little bit more about the sort of structure and background to the cards themselves, so people get an insight into how you develop them?
So all of the images are my photographs, and the way we developed them, we started off initially having quite abstract images. We felt we were looking kind of for an equivalent of a recherche ink blot. So you see the image and you interpret what you want in that image. And in fact, there are a number of cards that people will say, oh, you know that card, and they'll label it, they'll call it something. And I won't tell them actually what the card is, what the actual photograph is, because it represents something to them, and they're in the middle, particularly my clients, my coaching clients, they'll be in the middle of a story or kind of an interpretation around that card, and I think, well, actually it's not that at all, it's something completely different. So it doesn't matter, the point is it doesn't matter what the image is, it's how they interpret it and what it means to them in their story, in that process, the coaching process. When we started out, we had lots and lots of abstract images, and some of the feedback we got was, could we also have some concrete images, please, some more obvious, clear images? And in talking to a therapist recently, she said actually having concrete and abstract is really important, because there are certain interventions that she would work with her clients where she would want to keep them more concrete. Perhaps she doesn't want to go quite so deep. She wants to keep it a little bit more cognitive. So she will use the more concrete images to begin with, and then flow into the abstract images later in the process. So there was a mixture of abstract and concrete, and we'll see those in a minute when we go on to Deckhive. They are double-sided, which if you look at the original kind of choice, which was in obviously the physical images, having them double-sided forced a choice. So there was that process of physically turning, going, do I want this one or do I want this one? Is that more appropriate or that one? Clearly what's great about Deckhive, which we didn't have on Miro or Jamboard, is that turning mechanism. What that does is the turning process and the selecting process actually slows the brain right down. So for somebody who's quite cognitive, it will enable them to go into a more emotional and engaged, possibly somatic space. So this double-sidedness is important. Equally, and as you saw on this card, the colours are quite different. And the reason for that is because, again, it kind of creates this sense of choice and this forced choice. So also you'll see that a card will be an abstract, it might be a close-up, and then it might be a building. So there's something, again, about the choice of the different types of cards on either side, so that's really important. We selected a number of different types of images. There are images of people, there are images of landscapes, of animals, of seascapes, cityscapes, all sorts of different types to attract people in different ways, and also to satisfy that kind of storytelling process. As I said before, no words. One of the reasons that Michele and I developed this was because we felt that most of the cards on the market were word-based. And if we wanted to help people to kind of sink a bit more into the emotions, having no words at all was really important, because words are quite can be quite directive and are also very personal. So if you have an image with the word attached, you're creating a relationship between what that word means to somebody and what that image means to someone. So if you actually take the words out, it's much simpler and it's much more divergent and much more flexible in terms of the way you can use them. So is there anything else I want to say? I've talked about abstract, talked about the shapes of the cards. I would say that's probably it in terms of the background, the underpinnings of the cards.
That makes a lot of sense. And I can certainly relate to that sense of it being much more freeing when you've just got images and there's nothing, as you say, it allows people to interpret them however they like if you don't put words on. And then it becomes about their process, doesn't it, that they go through.
I would say one thing actually, because one thing that can put somebody off is if they're not a visually based person. And they might say, look, I'm a coach, I tend to be quite cognitive, I work with academics or scientists, I don't really want to work with images. And we have actually one example of somebody who is like that. So she's much more cognitive based, she's much more thinking oriented. And to begin with, she's actually, Michele, my business partner, is a supervisor, and this woman is one of her supervisees. And Michele tends to use the cards as an opener, as a kind of an icebreaker for her sessions. And this woman was really kind of not enjoying using the cards, but she had a bit of an epiphany, because what happened was she started to realize that in having that attitude of, I don't tend to use creative instruments, I'm quite cognitive, she was not opening herself up to opportunities to work with her clients in a different way. And she actually said, just having a set of the physical cards and access to the images on Deckhive opens me up to thinking about different ways of being with my client. And then that opens it up for them to have different ways of being. So sometimes people say, oh, I'm not that kind of person that likes to work with cards or work with images. But actually, it can be really good for you as a coach to have that opening up of the way that you see the world. So that, I found that kind of really instructive when this was sort of a year or so ago, and she started using them, and she said she absolutely loves them now. So it's this sort of switch for her, which was really interesting.
That is really interesting, isn't it? And that, yes, useful insight in terms of what you might find useful. Actually, your clients might find something else, and it's about having that breadth of tools available, isn't it? In part, yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Now, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about how you're expecting the cards to be used. You know, as you were developing them, what was your anticipation, and how were you thinking about using them? It is now a good time to show your slide that I know you had a slide that you wanted us to share.
Thank you very much. So this is one of my images, and I just created this slide for today because I wanted to explain that each of these exercises can be used at a different level. So if you're working with a client who is quite cognitive, who is not really accessing their emotions particularly well, you might want to start with one of the exercises on the left-hand side, because the one on the left, the strengths, development needs and weaknesses, which we'll come on to in a minute, is actually quite a cognitive exercise. So it's a very simple exercise where you'd be asking your client to pick 3 images, one for a strength, one for a development need, and one for a weakness. And we'll come on to the difference between development needs and weaknesses when we do the exercise quickly in a minute. This is quite a nice way in to using imagery in a way that is less scary for people who aren't used to using imagery. It's pretty quick. You can go into a level of emotion, but the initial part of that exercise is quite a cognitive thing. I'm just selecting things that relate to my strengths and weaknesses. If you have more time, if you want to work at a deeper level, you might use arrivals and departures. Actually, it's quite quick, but it does, and I've got some feedback from some of my clients, which I thought I'd share with you later, about how they're using them. And some of them say, actually, it's pretty amazing how quickly you go to quite a deep level just with picking an image. So you might use it as an icebreaker or an arrivals exercise, but actually it can reveal such a lot about you so quickly because you're interpreting an image, and that says a lot about your values and your principles and your kind of way of being. So the arrivals and departures, mindfulness is also a nice one to do. It can be a way of settling the system a bit. So I've got an example I'll share in a minute about a client that I work with, and I used a couple of exercises with him. It didn't work the first time, so I then did a mindfulness exercise, and then I did the exercise again, and it worked much better. So it can be a way of sort of settling the emotions in the system. If you've got more time, and Martin is going to be my guinea pig later. I'm going to get him to do a bit of storytelling. But if you have a longer period of time and you want to go to a deeper level, storytelling is really great. Metaphor are great too. And there's also something called Hero's Journey, which is Joseph Campbell, who created something called the Hero's Journey, looking at all of our lives and all of our narratives. And it came from storytelling and movies and films, and how we tell stories through the millennia. And then if we tell our own story, it says quite a lot about where we've been, but it also can say quite a lot of where we want to go to. So that's a much longer process. So it depends. And that's what I like about it. I think there's a fluidity and a flexibility to this approach, that you can pick where your client is at, client or clients, because I should say this works really well with groups as well. So I like that. I like that leveling. I think that's quite useful.
And quite important as a coach and facilitator, isn't it, to have that flexibility, to meet people where they're at, and to work with people at the level that's appropriate. Yeah, thank you. That's helpful, and it will be good to see those examples as you're going to show us in a minute. But have you got any examples before we get to sort of the details of how you work through different exercises? Have you got any examples of where the cards have had particular impact? I mean, you referenced a minute ago a client you're going to tell us about.
Yeah, I thought, rather than just telling you how I think they work, I thought, why don't I actually ask the people using them? So I did a little survey. I went out to people and I said, I'm doing this session with Deckhive. Can you let me know how you're using them at the moment, and what your feedback is? And so forgive me, I'm going to just do some reading. So this is one person who used them with a group of executives. She said, they're all very high on the rational, serious academic side and scientists. It took them into a really different space. It was a fantastic opener. And as a tool, it quickly built psychological safety and openness. So for her, there was a real political, cultural environment going on with this group where they didn't trust each other. And bringing the cards in as an opener and a starter to this session was a really great way of setting the kind of scene, setting how they were going to work together. So she found that really very powerful. So she's been using them with groups. Somebody else, I'm just going down the list, somebody else uses them in one-to-ones. She said, and I like this, she said, if I can sense the issue is sensitive, where the client would prefer not to disclose lots of content, or it's complex and they're not sure what's going on, then she'll invite them to use the cards. And she said, she's got lots of examples, but she says in general, this generates a rich reflection and insights. The dialogue that emerges can be really powerful and create a real shift in energy. So she talks about some of her clients really making quite quick shift on sort of, you wouldn't quite expect how much of a shift you can make because somebody's accessing a different part of their system. They're going into a more emotional space. And I personally experienced this. I was working with a client who had 25 years in the creative industry, top of his game, very well known in his industry. And he's looking to make a shift. He's hit 50 and he's going through a kind of bit of a midlife crisis. And we used the cards, and I was really fascinated to see how he used them, because I expected him to be really creative in the way that he used them. He didn't use them creatively at all. He just searched for images, quite concrete images, that showed the kind of work that he wanted to do in the future. So he picked a picture of a child playing with pigeons. He goes, well, I want to do something that is, fun. And he picked a picture of a woman, and he said, I want to do it in this way. It was all very concrete, and the conversation wasn't really going anywhere. It felt quite superficial. And explored this a bit with him. And he'd said, well, I just rushed into picking images that kind of interpreted or displayed the future I thought that I should have. We then did a mindfulness exercise with cards, and then we came back again when he was a bit more kind of less anxious. And then he ended up being really slow and very deliberate in his choices. And he picked all abstract images, which were really open to interpretation, and ended up with not a series of jobs that he might want to do, but a series of values and aspirations and hopes for his future, which were much more open. And that process started a kind of 2-3 session exploration of his future, which was much more open and expansive, and actually created the outcome, which was a much stronger outcome than we would have got to. So I had to tackle him on it a bit, because he wanted to rush to a quick solution, but that's how it's worked, particularly for me. Yeah. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's interesting. A good example of sometimes needing to come back to something and encouraging people to approach it differently. Yeah. And thank you for that. Well, it would be good to hear more about the specific exercises and how you work through them. So we've got some Deckhive tables set up, haven't we, for you to take us through and talk us through how you might go about working with individuals. So this first one, arrivals and departures, do you want to tell us a little bit about how this would work?
Yes. So there's 2 ways to do this. So you can either lay out all the cards, and we've just got, Martin's laid out a small number on the table. But you can also ask individuals to just go to the tray on the left-hand side. So Martin, if you click on that and you just open it up and you ask people to scroll down, you can do it that way too. So what you might do is you would invite either your individual client, or if you're working with groups, you'd invite them to select a card. You'd pose them a question. So for an arrivals question, you might say something quite like, what are your hopes for this session? And you would leave them a few minutes to select one card. They'd go down the tray, they would flip it, or if you've done your preparation beforehand and you've got them all laid out on the table, you'd ask them just to scan and to pick a card. And then Martin, if you just pick a card and put it under arrivals, and then what I would ask is, I would say, I'd invite them to say something about why that card stood out for them. What is it about that card that represents how they're arriving in the session? They might say something like, well, I'm excited. I feel quite flexible and fluid, and I'm not quite sure where I'm going to land, but I'm quite excited to be here, for example. You can do exactly the same for a departures exercise. You might say, what do you notice about how we work together today? Or you might say, what have you learned? What are you taking away? Or how are you leaving this session? So what's quite nice, and I haven't mentioned actually about the name Liminal Muse, and I'll say something briefly about that. What we're aiming for with the cards is to help people between those liminal spaces of arriving. Often our clients are arriving from a very busy schedule. Their heads are not in the right space for coaching, and it's a way of physically arriving them, slowing their system down and engaging them in their emotions and slowing down the cognitions. Equally with departures, it's a really good opportunity to say, okay, we're putting there's a container here. This is the edge of that container. We've come to the end of our session. This is a way of sort of slowing the brain back down and going, okay, I'm about to leave, I'm going back out into the world. So it's quite a nice, there's a sort of psychological safety there. There's a kind of container that you're providing for somebody. And that works just as well with individuals as groups. You can get small groups to co-facilitate it themselves. Let's say you've got 20 people. You could have groups of 2 or 3. They could be talking to each other about how they're arriving or departing, or you can do it in a plenary. It's very, very flexible. Or equally, you can do it with one-to-one. So yes, either select on the tray or set up the board, the table beforehand.
And in that context, because I imagine this might be something that people are thinking of, is how important is the conversation that comes with that? So say, for example, you've got a large group. Does it work if you simply ask them to select the image and personally reflect?
Yes.
Or is that...
Yep, you can do that too. So I've done it that way where we haven't had a huge amount of time. We've had a very, very big group. And we've just asked them to take a moment to reflect. You can use it for a mindfulness exercise where you ask somebody to pick a card. You ask them to look at that card for 1 minute, to just look at the colors and the shapes and the sizes and just use it as a muse to kind of reflect on life. And then I've also done it where you then ask them for 1 other minute to shut their eyes and just reflect and remember that image. And then they can either write in their notebook what comes up or they can share that with others. So it's really... I suppose I want to reiterate, this is incredibly flexible. You can use it in all sorts of different ways.
And it sounds like the important bit is that you're encouraging people to focus, whatever that focus might be. It's about drawing their attention to the now and engaging in the moment.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so really nice simple exercise. I can see used in lots of situations. So we've got another one, haven't we?
Yes, let's go to table two. So Martin, can I invite you to, I'm not actually asking you to do a proper exercise here, but I'm going to invite you to pick 3 cards, 1 for strengths, something you think you're really, really good at. So pick 1 for a development need and 1 for a weakness. And I'll explain the difference between the development need and the weakness. Performance management processes basically conflate development needs and weaknesses. They pretty much say everything you're not very good at, you need to get better at. Well, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we are not good at, but isn't required for our job, that we have teams of people underneath us who can support us in that area. We have coping strategies that enable us to work quite efficiently without having that as a strength. So this exercise is quite a cognitive exercise. This exercise is a great way to help people to remember what they're good at. So if you're dealing with somebody who has self-esteem issues, it's a really great way if you say, okay, I'm going to ask you to pick 20 cards and you find that kind of 18 of them are in the development needs section, then you can be working on building confidence and self-esteem by having more cards in the strengths area. Generally, I just pick 3. It's really interesting to talk about. So I would ask Martin, I'd say, can you tell me a little bit about why these cards have jumped out to you? Maybe describe what it is about that strengths card, why you picked that, what does that represent in terms of your strengths? And I don't know if Martin, you want to say something or where.
I'm happy to share a little bit.
Yeah, great.
So in relation to the strengths one, for me, that was around the linkages and the connections between people and things.
Great. And what about the development needs?
That was about coming up a level and seeing things from a higher perspective so that you get a broader view of the component parts.
And what about the weakness? So that's the bit where you're not so good, but you don't feel it's something you need in your current role to develop. So it's something you can put aside.
Yeah, that might not be such a good example, but it was kind of, it was around being perfectionistic with things and how that can sometimes be a weakness. So yeah, it may not fit quite so well with your definition there.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And then I might observe how you pick the cards. So for example, in this situation, you pick them very fast. So I might invite you to come back and do it again, because it may be that you were slightly in your head. I mean, you're co-facilitating a workshop, so it's completely understandable if you weren't like going, okay, right, let me think a bit more deeply. But I might invite you to do it a second time and slow the process down. I might also, this is not such a good example, but I've had it in the past where all of the images have been very dark, because there's also a range of images in the pack that are light and dark. And I'd say, I'm just observing something. I don't know if there is anything in this, but all of your images are quite dark. Can you say something about that? And you go, oh, well, actually, I'm feeling very gloomy, or whatever it is. You might ask them to probe, you might probe the difference between the cards. So I say, that's very interesting. The one on the left is quite angular. It's a built environment, and the other two are softer. Is there a relationship between your comfort with your strength and your discomfort with your development needs. So you just start to probe and you start to help them to explore the story around the images that they've selected. You might even ask what the overall themes are. So you might say, there are no people in that, Martin. That's really interesting. Can you say a bit about that? I'm not actually asking you that question, but so you might just be looking for the themes that come up, depending on what level you want to go to. But I would iterate, this is quite a cognitive exercise. It can go into the deeper levels, but it's often really helpful for people who might feel more uncomfortable with imagery.
So when would you typically use this exercise?
I've used it before, as I said earlier, I've had a coaching client who I'm no longer working with, but who really struggled with identifying what her strengths were. She really struggled to talk positively about herself. So we spent a lot of time focusing on the strengths area. So it was quite interesting at the beginning, and I mentioned when I asked her to pick lots and laid them all out on the table, and there was just this massive group in the kind of weakness and development needs, and there was just this really dearth of cards in the strength. So for me, there was a theme there about the lack of balance in her own interpretation of her strengths and weaknesses. I've also used it in executive coaching for clients who are just trying to, a particular client who was moving into a new role, and we talked about some of the challenges that he was finding in this new role and talking about some of the resources he needed. So we talk about the strengths, we talk about the development needs, and we'd also talk about his weaknesses and say, okay, this is a weakness of yours, that's fine. You've elected not to work on it. What coping strategies have you got in place? What resources have you got in place to tackle that? So again, you'd invite the client to start selecting some cards that would represent those resources they might need and find supportive. And that's when they can then start doing sort of more kind of cognitive work about project planning and putting in place actions to get those resources in place.
That's I was just thinking that as you were speaking, it sounds like this, you're starting off with the raising self-awareness piece, that's the initial conversation, and then it's moving on to action, be that about planning or building self-confidence or whatever it might be. It's moving forward with it. Thank you.
I would say one more thing that I might then round off the conversation and ask them about what they enjoyed about the process. So if I go back to my creative guy, he hated it. And he found this quite disturbing because he said, I've been working in creative industry for 25 years. Why did I hate that process? I really hated it. And we had long discussions about that being very unexpected for him. And that opened up a lot of insight for him about how he's going to shift his career. So there are some meta kind of awareness things that you can, as a coach, you can be doing, asking people how they felt using them, what shifts or insights they've got from using them at the end of the process.
So it's observations about the process as well as the choices made.
That's right.
Yeah. Now I think the third exercise you wanted to talk us through was taking things to a different level again. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So this is just, I mean, we're not going, I'm not doing a full coaching session with Martin. We've got a couple of minutes, but Martin, could I invite you, we've set this up already, so I'm not springing this on Martin. He's already got something in mind. Martin, I'd welcome you thinking about the dilemma that we've talked about. Could you please select 3 or 4 images that represent or sum up this dilemma that you have in mind? And while Martin's doing that, I'll just do a bit of a voiceover. What's quite useful about this is I'm looking at Martin selecting the images on the left, but I'm also looking at his face. And obviously this is harder on Zoom, but I can, and he's only, in my screen, he's about that big, but I'm kind of watching his process of selection and interaction with the cards. I'm looking at the pace. I'm noticing where he's placing them, and I haven't asked him to place them in any particular order. So one of the things I could be asking him is, in a moment, I could say, oh, that's quite interesting. I see that you've got the woman on the left and this abstract in the middle. Can you say something about the relationship between those two? And he may have not even thought about that relationship. He may not have even become aware of that. I'll give you an example of a client I work with. She selected an image, and there's an image in this deck of a man on top of a roof of a caravan with some binoculars. And she'd selected it because she was trying to build a business, and she was thinking about the strategy of the business. And what was very interesting is that in the order of these 3 or 4 cards, she'd put the guy with the binoculars at the end of the order. And I invited her to see what might shift if she shifted the order. So she felt very stuck. And so she took this image of the man and with the binoculars and put it at the start of her storytelling. She said, oh, I've got everything in the wrong order. The sequencing is all wrong. So this really shifted her thinking and kind of lightened her in this process of where she was feeling quite overwhelmed with running this business. So there's something about the ordering of them and the sequencing of them and how they interrelate. So what I'm noticing with Martin is, Martin, you're still looking for your 4th. That's I don't know if you're actually looking, because we're doing a quasi coaching session. But
I am.
Are
looking.
you?
Yeah.
So this is interesting. The first 3 were really quite swift.
Yeah. So should I say a bit about my thought process? So what I'm trying to do at the moment is find something that provides a particular thought I've got. So with the one so far, the picture kind of immediately had a connection about the dilemma, and so they represent particular aspects of that dilemma. But then in doing that, I kind of feel like that's skewed my narrative around it somehow, and so I want to find a slightly different angle. And so now I'm looking at the pictures, trying to see one that I can tell that story about. Okay. Which maybe, so it's almost around the other way. And that's why it's taking me a bit longer, because I'm just trying to think, well, so it might be this one. I can tell a story around that one.
Okay. And are they in terms of the order, are they in the order you'd like them to be in?
No, they're just in the order that I came across them. So
would you like to reorder them if you're telling a story? Is there a sequence? Maybe there isn't a sequence.
It probably would be. I might leave it as it is. I think that's probably as good as any other. And
I'd invite you to share with us some of the feelings that you had. You talked about the first 3 jumping out at you. If you feel comfortable sharing, because there's obviously some of us watching you while watching your internal kind of process. Can you say a bit more about that process you've just been through in terms of the first 3 jumped out? Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, so this lady kind of, I chose the picture because she's looking, in my mind, she's looking to the future. So there was something kind of hopeful about her. And there was kind of almost a planful element about that, I suppose, about sort of looking beyond the challenge now to where do I want to get to. So that's kind of the connection with that one. This one was kind of more about the form of it, so I don't know what that is, maybe a part of a building or something, but for me it was because it just looks difficult and angular. And so it's a kind of like, this is not necessarily a nice thing to have to kind of deal with or figure out how to kind of move forward with it. So that kind of represented kind of part of the dilemma. And this one was similar, I suppose, in a sense that it's like the answer's in there somewhere, but I don't know where. And it's a lot of murkiness around it, and wanting to be able to see the light within it, and to be able to focus on all of that sort of scenario, to think, well, that's the bit that we need to kind of go for. So that's kind of the story with that.
I'm going to pause you there. I'm looking at the time and thinking, I'm going to say a couple more things, and then we probably should move on, because we haven't even taken questions yet. One thing I might ask somebody to do is to rearrange them. So, for example, you finding that murky, I might invite you to change not only its place on the board, but I might ask you to kind of orientate it slightly differently, or put it behind something, or I might ask you to order them, or put exactly like that. So there's a playfulness in that storytelling that I might say, and if you were to shift that, would that shift anything in your thinking? And then you might kind of go to a different level on that. I think we probably should leave that there. Do you think, Michele? I'm thinking.
I think that's yeah. Well, if people have particular questions about that, then they can ask them in a moment. But I think that's given a really good insight to as you say, the different levels of the cards and the different places that you can go with them, whether you're using the physical deck or whether you're using them on Deckhive. So I'm conscious that you said a few minutes ago you wanted to say something about the name Liminal Muse, and I don't want to lose sight of that. Did you want to say anything about that?
Yes. So when we were coming up with the idea of what we would call them, we felt that this was the process of helping people to get to that space, that liminal space between coaching and the outside world, or between the thoughts and the feelings. So it's something about how do you bridge that gap? How do you make that, how do you travel in that direction? So we like the idea of liminal and liminality, that the edges of things, the edges of awareness, or the edges between, a coaching session or life. And then we like the idea of a muse because the use of an image. So if you go back to Recherche ink blot, the ink blots don't really mean anything, but it's what you interpret them to mean. It's just a mirror. It's a way of reflecting. If you can't quite access what's going on, it's a way of reflecting that and kind of bringing that to the surface. So we really like the idea of liminal and muse together. And so hence the name Liminal Muse was born. Some people go, I don't know what that means. So I have to kind of educate people on what the word liminal means. But
no, it's always good to hear the reasoning behind the names for things. I think I like that. Yeah, thank you. Now, in a moment, I'm going to invite anyone who's got a question to shout up. But if you want to put your question in the chat, then please do. But otherwise, in a moment, feel free to unmute and show yourself and ask your question if you'd like to. But before we do that, Charlotte, is there anything else you wanted to cover that we haven't talked about? Any last minute thoughts?
Yes, actually, there is. Thank you. I am talking to some universities about doing some research on this, because when we first moved from using the physical card pack to the online digital cards, this is when we were doing our kind of slightly rubbish version of Miro and Jamble, not Deckhive, which is much better. We were worried that moving online would not have the same impact. And we ran some workshops and actually were just really quite surprised at the impact. So we run some B2B workshops with coaches, and the coaches would go off into breakout groups and come back, and some of them would say, blimey, that was quite full on. I mean, I've only just met this other person and I'm already talking about some really important things. And we were quite surprised at how that was still working, even though we didn't have, the kind of physical, the kinesthetic nature of the card pack. So I'm actually talking to Birkbeck and University College Cork, and also Aston University, about possibly asking a coaching master's student or an occupational psychology student to do a research project on this. And I've got some ideas of what might be ways of researching, looking at personality and choice, looking at abstract versus concrete, looking at sequencing of cards, and just trying to understand a bit more why imagery is slowing down the brain and helping us access emotions. And I've been talking to a ex-academic who is a world expert on imagery and cognition, and who's now trained to be a therapist. So she's quite a nice combination. And we're going to talk more about some research we might do. So I'm hoping to offer that in the next sort of year or so, probably 9 months, to people who might use the cards. So a little bit of background in terms of, if you've got a client who wants to understand the science of it, then this could help with you sharing that information.
That's great. Yeah, it would be really interesting to hear how that progresses. I'm sure all of us who use card decks in our work will be interested to hear that. Thank you. So we've got a few questions in the chat. A couple of them I suspect might relate as much to Deckhive and how that works as to Charlotte's deck. So I will talk in a moment very briefly about Deckhive, but let's cover off the questions that relate specifically to Charlotte's questions first. So Natalie, you've asked about to what extent the card decks can be used with groups of people as well as with individuals. As I say, I'll talk about how that works in relation to Deckhive in a moment, but do you want to say anything about Liminal Muse cards?
Yes, I think, using it with physical cards is great, although, what Deckhive brings is you don't have to then buy 20 packs of the cards. Deckhive is unlimited, so that's great. You can use it with numbers of people in terms of the tables. But just in terms of the functionality, I tend to do it with Zoom and Deckhive, and I will put people in breakout rooms of 2 or 3. If you have 2, then you can have a coach and coachee, and then they can switch. If you have 3, you can have coach, coachee, and observer. So again, they're learning from different levels. They're being in the exercise, they're watching the exercise, and then they're managing the exercise. So it gives a rounded view of how that exercise works. You can then come back into plenary and share those learnings, or you can get people to do, we've done it before in reflective exercises where we get people to write and reflect on what they've learned. We've run workshops where we've used imagery, i.e. Deckhive cards, Liminal Muse cards, and music. We've done workshops for agile coaches, so I'm slightly more kind of cognitive end of it. But we use it all the time with up to 30 people. I've done a workshop with 30 people, but you then need to manage the breakouts.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. Now, Jan has asked about any reading. Do you have any reading associated with that? If you do, then maybe that's something we can take from you and we can put it in the mail out that we send out to people afterwards.
Yes, so I did a lot of research about a year ago on all the kind of background. Why does imagery work so well? I've got bundles and bundles of links to academic papers and all sorts of reading. Also, this is a great book. This is somebody I'm working with at the moment. This is a bit of a plug. I'm going to be running a workshop with her for career coaches, and some really lovely stuff in there about imagery and working with in different ways with kind of cards and that kind of thing. So yes, I can send all sorts of things through. You'll have too many to read.
Brilliant, thank you. And Claire has asked whether some people find it difficult to discuss emotional concepts. Is that a challenge?
Yes, some people do, absolutely. And then I would suggest that you start with the more cognitive end. So you can talk about strengths, weaknesses, and development needs without going into too many levels of emotion. You can just it's a good way to observe and identify without talking too much about your emotions. Generally, people find that they ease into it quite quickly, more quickly than they would imagine. But I would say start with strengths, development needs, and weaknesses if that is an issue with your client.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, if you have any last minute questions, then please do put them in the chat. I think Martin might just say something for a moment about Deckhive and how that works and how that fits in with what we've been talking about.
Yep, I can do. And just, and you'll notice there's another question about groups that's coming on the chat there again, so you can pick up on that in a second. But just in terms of the concept of Deckhive, we do have other webinars that we're running, so you will see details of those in a link we'll send on the follow-up email. So if you want a half-an-hour session on the practicalities of using Deckhive, or a longer tutorial where you can come in and have a play and experience being in a session yourself, then we have those sessions available in the next couple of months. But essentially, as you've seen already, it's a simple platform for using the cards online, and we have a number of decks of cards in the library. So Liminal Muse is one of the first that we have in there, but we have a number of others and a few others already on their way in the pipeline. So we now have a subscription model to use the platform. So we have a free plan that gives you access to some decks, but sadly not the Liminal Muse deck. So to access this and the other decks have been designed by experts, then you have to be on one of our paid plans, and we have a starter plan for a relatively limited amount of use, which is suitable for those of you who are running up to 5 sessions a month. And we have an unlimited plan, which allows you to run as many sessions with as many different of the decks in our library as you like. So there are various options there, but it's very easy to get started. And in fact, we'll include a code in our follow-up email that you can use to get a month free. So if you wanted to sign up for the unlimited plan and give it a proper try, then we can include that in the link. And unless, Charlotte, you happen to know your code is off the top of your head?
I don't.
No, I can't remember it either. But never mind. We'll put it in email.
Charlotte?
It might be.
I think it's just Charlotte.
We'll put it in email and in
Yes.
in the notes on the footer on YouTube. So if you just in case it's different, best just to confirm there before you use that. But that'll give you a free month before, if you want to start on one of the paid plans, to have a proper play with the Liminal Muse deck and see how you get on with it. Is that enough, Michele, for now?
I think so. And as Martin said, we're running other sessions on how Deckhive works. So please do join us for one of those if you'd like to know more. So Natalie's last question on the explanation on using the cards with groups. You're saying that's very helpful, and the idea of running those in breakout groups. How well do you think it would work and be accepted to run the strengths exercise as one large group rather than breaking it down? This would be in the spirit of helping the team to create a culture of open feedback.
I think that would be a lovely place to arrive at. It probably wouldn't where I'd start. I'd want to open up the conversation with maybe some other things. So for example, you could be picking a card that you most like. So you might select a card that jumps out at you, and you would then explain why it is you chose that card. So you might start in that way before you then went into, and it depends when you say strengths, is it the individual picking a card for their own strength, or is it a team strength? Because I think if it's an individual, you might want to ease into that.
Yeah, it would be, I would be thinking, Charlotte, about an individual picking a card for their colleague.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I wouldn't do that as the first intervention. I would ease them into it. It depends on how well they know each other and what the trust, how psychologically safe do they feel the space is. If they know each other really well, they're used to having these kind of conversations, go for it. If they're perhaps new to working with each other, or they haven't done this kind of exercise before, I might do something a bit more introspective or in smaller groups, and then ease them in, because it might be a bit of a shock. Like, yeah. Oh.
Yeah, no, I definitely wouldn't do it as the first session, only after I've built that psychological safety, I think.
Then I think it's a lovely idea. Lovely idea.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions? And we've lost Michele. So Martin, I think you're going to have to drive now.
Yeah, so she's fallen off. I know her connection was a bit dodgy, but thankfully wasn't too bad. So yeah, the comment about Judith Weiser.
Yeah, Judy Weiser.
About phototherapy. Yeah, so
yeah, I know Judy quite well, and she's basically done a huge amount for the business of phototherapy. So she's been going, I don't know, Bara's dropped off, but she would be able to say, I think she's been around for 30 years or so on pushing the agenda of phototherapy. So she's fantastic. There's a Facebook group for phototherapists. Natalie, you're nodding. I don't know if you're on there. Bara, you're still here. Hi, Bara. Yeah, so she's been around for quite some time. She's fantastic. She's got her own series of books on phototherapy. So if you're more interested in taking photographic images for coaching or therapy further, it's a good place to go, is the Facebook group, Phototherapy Techniques.
Well, I guess we're up against time now, aren't we? Yeah. So I guess we should wrap up. But thank you all for coming, and thank you, Charlotte, for sharing your story of how you got here. And I'm sure there's plenty more chapters to come in the journey with Liminal Muse in the years to come. But yeah, thank you for creating it in the first place. Thank you for having it on Deckhive so that our users are able to benefit from your creativity and your insights and wisdom about how they can use them, and I'm sure people will continue to find their own ways to use them, won't they? That's the beauty of this kind of deck, is it's infinitely flexible. So yeah, so thanks everyone, and we'll look forward to seeing you at one of our future sessions. So do come along and learn about some more of the decks, and this recording will be up on our YouTube channel, if not by the end of today, then tomorrow. So you're very welcome to watch again or catch up on any bits you might have missed. So we'll look forward to seeing you again soon, but take care.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.